how real is SEC bias? Just how real is it? Is it real at all? Is there any validity to this thought that the SEC gets preferential treatment? I want to give some background before we jump into this conversation. Because a lot of times, and this is something we see in the comment section a lot, is you'll speak positively about any number of SEC teams, and the comment that will pop up, I would say, 1 in 4 videos is SEC homer. I know when I see it, SEC homer. They're in Nashville, right? That's SEC country. They're not far from Knoxville. They're SEC people, I can tell. Well, for me personally, I grew up in Southern California. Okay, so not an SEC country. Did I spend some time in Atlanta early on? Absolutely. But I grew up, went to high school in Southern California. I did not go to an SEC school. Nobody in my immediate family went to an SEC school. Also worth noting that I shouldn't say that. Most of my family, I was going to say I had nobody in my extended family go to an SEC school, but that's not true. I have 1 or 2 cousins. At the end of the day, like, the SEC ties for me are very minimal. So when I talk about SEC teams, like, I'm not coming at it with some sort of bias like, oh man, my dad went to this school, my mom went to this school. Like, we're just talking about it at a face value level. So the 2 major, I think, gripes people have when it comes to SEC bias is, 1, they get all the coverage. People just want to talk about the SEC, and they give them preferential treatment with how they cover them because they are the SEC. That's 1. The other gripe people have is that when it comes down to a 50-50 scenario and it could go either way, they will give the SEC the benefit of the doubt because of logos, because of ratings. Is that true? Again, that's the whole discussion we're trying to have here. How real is SEC bias? I'll start with the sports media side of things. Sports media, as with any other business, is still about supply and demand. Still about supply and demand. Like, if I ran a grocery store and people are buying Pop-Tarts like they are going out of style, like we cannot keep enough Pop-Tarts on the shelves, and I'm running this grocery store, would it be a good idea for me to say, you know what we need in this grocery store? More green beans. They're like, JD, nobody's bought green beans, for the last couple of weeks. Hey, I like green beans. I want green beans on the shelves. JD, would it not be better to go buy more Pop-Tarts so we can keep those in stock? Because that's what the people want, right? Nope, I don't want to hear it. Green beans. What sense does that make? That doesn't make any sense for anybody, right? It's not good for the audience. Definitely not good for my grocery store. Where does that leave us? And I think that's kind of the same thought around this thing when it comes to sports media. This is still a supply and demand operation. Like, if there are fan bases that happen to be in the Southeastern Conference that demand content around college football for their team, we're going to do that. We're going to try and meet your demand with supply. My job is to provide you content that is engaging, insightful, unbiased, but also just at the bare bones, my opinion. And so just because we talk about a specific team in the SEC or we talk about that conference more in general, it's not slanting my opinion. It just means this is what you find interesting, so we're going to give you what you want and provide you the Pop-Tarts that you keep telling us that you would like. And again, that's not speaking ill of any other team or conference or anything else. There's a lot of other teams and other conferences that move the needle as well, but just because the SEC has this large demand, of course you're going to see that in the supply and demand business, the supply try and meet that demand. Now, it's also interesting because I think there's this thought that, hey, well, it's all about logos in the SEC. Not necessarily, because remember, too, Colorado, before Deion Sanders got there, nobody was talking about Colorado. Why? Because they weren't relevant. Like, there was no reason to talk Colorado. They were a 1-win football team. And this past season, it wasn't like they were lighting the world on fire and being a college football playoff contender. They won 4 games. But even so, what happened? The demand increased drastically. Why? Because of Coach Prime. Not because of the logo, but because there was an audience around Colorado that was like, hey, we care about Colorado. We care about Deion Sanders. We find it interesting. I'm like, I agree. I find it super interesting. It's relevant to the college football world right now. Let's have a conversation about it. Let's talk about it. And that, again, that doesn't mean that we're slanting our opinion to favor that audience, but it does mean that when you have a demand for content, we are going to do our due diligence and do our job to meet you with a supply for that demand. So that's that whole discussion around sports media. I don't think there's this like thought that we have to give the extra favorable takes to the SEC or anything like that, but there is obviously, again, supply and demand. That's just kind of how any business works. But there's also this thought that within that, they say, okay, well, you just said it. You have to have supply to meet the demand. So that means when it comes down to the SEC making the college football playoff or getting benefit of the doubt in certain situations, or I've heard conspiracy theories all the way down to the referees, that's why the SEC gets the benefit of the doubt. Hear me clearly. Want to put a pause on this. This is not commentary on the Florida State-Alabama situation. It's not. I've said many times, I think Florida State got absolutely gypped in that situation, so we'll leave that at that. But, again, the SEC bias conversation is that when it gets to 50-50, people will lean SEC. So I'm here to say I don't think that when it comes down to these situations, 110% of the time, the right decision is made. At the end of the day, especially in a situation where people are having to make a decision, it comes down to a judgment call. It comes down to a judgment call. You're looking at different variables, different factors, different statistics to try and give you a gauge as to which way you should lean on a discussion, whether it's a team getting to the college football playoff, whether it's specific players winning awards. Like, I'm just here to tell you, I'm not putting a parameter around this so specific to where we can nail it down to like one specific instance, just because I don't think that's healthy or helpful for anyone. But overall, when it comes down to things being 50-50, it could go either way. What do we go to? Just as college football fans, regardless of who's involved in the conversation from a conference level, we go to the eye test, right? You hear that a lot. Go to the eye test. And so when you go to the eye test, you look at the SEC pretty quickly and realize, okay, those teams just, quite frankly, look different than some of the other teams. And that sounds kind of pompous. It sounds kind of arrogant because, quite frankly, it's just sort of taken at face value. But, like, when you look at the actual numbers behind it, too, if the SEC and media have some kind of conspiracy going on, here's the reality. The NFL is in on it. Because for the last 17 NFL drafts, the SEC has had the most players drafted. The SEC, I believe all time, or at least in the modern era, has had 209 players drafted. The next closest conference isn't even over 200. And so what I'm trying to say here is when you look at the eye test and you give the lean to the SEC because of how they look overall and how they match up with maybe X, Y, and Z team, it's not unfair to do because the NFL, quite frankly, is backing up that thought and saying, yeah, they got a lot of freak shows on that team. Yeah, they probably do deserve some benefit of the doubt here when it comes to that whole discussion. And then you go back to the college football playoff because that was another thought, too, of, well, hey, we go to 4 teams now, the SEC, your reign of terror is done. There's no shot you're going to have the dominance you had previously. And I'm not telling you that the SEC was as dominant as they were previously, but I am saying they won 6 out of those 10 college football playoff national championships. Here's the thing, too. We go to 12 teams. All we're doing is getting more SEC teams in. So this sounds like I'm holding water for the SEC, but at the end of the day here, it's supply and demand. If you have interest in what we're talking about, we're going to cater our content towards you. And then if it comes down to the eye test, it's 50-50. The SEC has had more NFL players drafted. People that have jobs to put food on the table for their families, dependent upon how they scout these specific players, are telling you, hey, the NFL likes the SEC. They got some freak show kind of dudes that can help us at the highest level of football in that conference. So is it 110% always the correct way to go about evaluating a team and evaluating talent and all that? Like, I'm not telling you it's foolproof, but I do think to say that there is SEC bias and it's all about ratings and logos, like, to me, that feels a little bit irresponsible and just, quite frankly, untrue. So when it comes down to being subjective, when it comes down to how you evaluate, I think it's fair to lean towards the NFL players on the teams in that conference, and the SEC has more NFL players. Period. Mic drop. The end. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.